Hi guys, my name is Kenzie and we're going to be painting with watercolor today, and I am excited about this piece mostly because one, the main color is purple, and I mentioned in my other video that purple is my favorite color, and also because lavenders are in bloom, I decided to go with this piece right here. It's very abstract and this is very challenging, especially if you're very new to watercolor. The biggest tip that I can give you right off the get-go is don't be discouraged. Just keep pushing through, even if you have to take a break and come back to it, especially the lavender field. It takes like 4 or 5 layers to it. And if you're not patient and don't let it dry, it's not going to layer properly and you will get frustrated. But this is definitely, especially if you're a beginner again, is going to push you outside your comfort zone. But that's what we're here for, is to learn and to grow as an artist. So let's get started. The materials I'm using today, I have my tapping cloth right here. I have my paintbrushes. I'm primarily going to be using my size 12 brush, and I also have my watercolor palette. I also have my 2 water cups right here as well. So I'm going to be using a lot of the wet on wet technique. This is my painter's tape. I like to cover the edges just a hair. I find that, I'll show you another example, it looks so much better when it has these like really nice lines around it. And I also love that I can tape it to the board, and I can move my board around and have some desk space if I don't finish painting a piece in one sitting. Okay, so let's tape this for now. I'm going to use my fresh water that I have right here. It's clear, nothing on it. And I think what I want to do is I want to start with the sky. So I'm going to apply my clear water, and you know what, since I'm going to be using a lot of wet on wet technique, I am not going to be messing up this water. Just be careful to not go inside the windmill. But I kind of want this to be a sunset kind of vibe, very loose. So I'm going to apply some blue at the top. I want it to be very light and airy as well. I don't want it to be too bright and vibrant with my colors. Yeah, that looks good. I'm happy with that. And I'm actually going to bring the purple into the blue just a little bit. It helps kind of blend out my sunset, so it just doesn't look like, you know, strict lines and stuff. So I'm just going in just a hair. And again, I'm just going to very ever so loosely bring it up just a little bit more, I think. And the reason why I'm doing the wet on wet technique and covering it completely with water first is because it really helps with some soft blends. It's easier to kind of move and manipulate the color when it's already wet like this. Okay, so after that color, I think I'm going to go with a really nice pinkish color. I'm going to add a little bit of red to it because I just think that's a little too, yeah, that's great. A little too peachy for me. So I just mixed the cadmium red with the rose red right there. I'm going to really carefully go around. I'm going to bring the purple down just a little bit into pink as well. Oops. Bring the purple up just a little Okay. I'm also now going to mix a little bit of orange, and I'm just going to put some yellow into that color that I just used. You can see here how it's starting to dry. It's not that wet anymore. So I'm going to apply some water right here at the bottom because I want it to be wet. Because I feel like when it's not wet, I can't really manipulate the colors that well. There we go. So this technique that I'm using, I don't know if I'm even going to be pronouncing it right. It's called alla prima, and where it's basically you're moving around and manipulating the colors directly on the paper. And this is what we use a lot with wet on wet too. It's a fun little fact for you. A little bit of orange. I feel like there's just not enough purple up here. Oh, that's too dark, so I'm going to use water to water that down. I want to bring up it just a little bit more. Okay, now I want to use a yellow just down towards the bottom. And you'll see here this line right here, it's going to be our mountain. So we're not going to go there. I'm going to try to stay above the mountain. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more orange into the yellow. Different spots. I'm going to go in to my sky and just add a little bit more contrast to certain spots to kind of look a little dull. Give it a little bit more pop. Okay. Pretty happy with that. Okay, so what we are going to do now is we are going to move on to the lavender field at the bottom because I don't want to touch any of this part right here because it's wet on wet. Otherwise, everything will just kind of explode and be a mess of colors. So I'm going to move down here so that up here has some time to dry. Okay, so I'm going to probably just work in sections a little bit. That way, when this section dries, I can work on this section and then we'll have a little bit more of a concrete line right here, because when this part's dry and I work on this part, that's how you kind of start to create some layers. So that's what I'm going to do over here. So I'm going to work in sections. I'm going to start with my first lavender field and I'm going to do the same technique as up top as I'm going to do my wet on wet technique. I'm going to apply my fresh water first. Don't worry too much about trying to stay in the lines. And I'm going to mix up a few different purple colors in my watercolor palette. So I'm going to be mixing a lot of blue and red together to make my own type of purple. I'm going to use a little bit of purple in my palette and I'm going to dull it down with some blue as well. So I have some different shades of blue. I want one that's really dark, so I want to add a lot more. Yeah. So you'll see I have 3 different types of purples. Kind of like that. I have one that's a little bit more reddish. I'm just going to go in and I'm going to start kind of blotting. This one I'm just tapping around my sheet of paper, just having different types of purples. Kind of like what we did with the sky, just kind of mixing it in just a little bit. This is a fun painting. It's very loose. And I'm going to use that darker purple towards kind of the creases where it should be like the rose between the lavender. So I'm going to do that. And don't be afraid to put and blend different types of purples into it as you go. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that being my first layer. I'm going to go in and give it just a little bit more detail. And I'm going to go in and let this kind of dry, and I'm going to work on this section right here. So I'm going to apply my wet on wet technique as well. It's a little bit trickier trying to stay inside of the lines right here. But again, don't be too hard on yourselves if you cannot stay in the lines. So when I first started painting, landscapes were definitely one thing that I really struggled with. Like, I just got it in my head that I just was terrible at them. And it took a lot of practice for me to kind of feel comfortable being loose with my watercolors and having patience to kind of sit around and paint for a long time. I found it way easier to sit and just paint flowers than it was to just paint skies and mountains and all the fun things. So I'm seeing how I obviously use a little bit too much water, but while it's still damp, I'm going in and I'm just going to be lifting some of that color, tapping my napkin. Yeah, I definitely used too much water, so it kind of puddled. Okay, that's okay. This is supposed to be loose. I'm not supposed to have perfect lines. Okay, that feels pretty good to me. So I want this to kind of be a lot lighter and airier than down here. So I'm going to be using a lot more water in my palette when I'm painting, just again to make it a lot less pigmented and a lot more airier. And I'm also not going to use such dark colors up here as well. I will definitely go darker towards, again, where the rose are supposed to be, but I'm not going to be using a lot of that dark color. And it got to the point with landscapes, like I would actually try painting a landscape and then partway through it, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I hate this, I'm terrible. And I would just stop instead of just trying to just take a break and come back to it later and trying to learn and fix it and stuff. And it took me a really long time to want to even try doing landscapes again. But I'm glad I stuck with it. And when I do my in-person workshops, I always tell people there's going to be a middle point where you're looking at this and you're very discouraged, but once you stick with it and see until the end, usually it comes together. So you'll probably hear me a lot in these videos saying, oh, you're in the middle zone, keep with it. You might not like it right now, but don't be discouraged, because I tell myself that a lot. Okay, I'm going to do this little section right here that's supposed to be kind of behind my little house. Windmill. I love the color combinations, and this purple is my favorite color, so this is really cool. I figured since it's summertime and lavender fields are starting to bloom here, that it'd be fun to kind of do a lavender theme painting. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other side. I'm trying not to touch, but if it touches, I'm not too worried about the background. It's supposed to be, you know, softer blends in the back with less details. So it looks like it's in the distance, so I'm not too worried if the back kind of start to blend together. when we do our wet on dry, we can kind of throw in a little bit more detail to kind of separate the rows a bit. See how right here it started to dry, so you have a harsher lines. Let me try and blend that out. Add some water. Especially when we start to do the backdrop, we definitely want this to be very light and airy. Okay, so I'm ready to move on to this section right here and this section, but the problem that I'm going to have is I want, particularly right here, to not start blending with this. I want there to be some contrast between the pieces. So what I want to do now is I'm just going to dry it with my dryer so that I can move on. Okay, and I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other two parts of the field. And you'll see how now everything's like the purple's not blending into here. So now we're definitely going to have a contrast between these two, and that's exactly what we wanted. Again, I'm not really worried too much if I'm not staying in the lines. And when you're doing this technique with water, I found that sometimes it was puddling. Definitely try not to have too much water, otherwise you're going to have some issues with puddling like I had, or the color's not blending quite as well. So a good enough layer where it won't dry right away, but again, you don't want it kind of sitting and puddling because your colors are going to look wonky. So yeah, about the light airy part of it. So when you're layering with watercolor, it's really important to start light, because if you start too dark, you won't be able to kind of see the differences of our colors. So I always recommend to add way more water to your paint that you're using. So say you have something kind of like this where you have a small mixing tray, and then you have your colors. I wouldn't directly work right from this and apply it, because you're going to have a lot of pigment and it's automatically going to be really bright and vibrant just because you're taking directly from your palette. If you have a little tray, or even get like a plastic plate and then put your brown right there with some water in your plate, that will automatically make it more light and airy. So that's a fun little tip for you guys. If you're struggling with your paintings just being way too bright, you can always just pull it into like a plate or like it. I was mixing some purple colors myself, like I wasn't just using the color directly, the purples directly in my palette. Like I like mixing up my own different shades of purple too, so I'm not just limited to what I have. I gotta work a little bit faster down here because I'm finding that my paper is drying pretty quickly. I want there to be more blue, more bluish tone. See how it's starting to dry right here? I'm going to add a lot more water to kind of compensate for that. Yeah, I have really bad seasonal allergies. I used to take a Claritin and Reactin, but I think my body's just so used to those medicines now that my body doesn't really do anything when I take them. I have to find something else. I heard that you can actually get a prescription from your doctor, which I don't love the idea of, but I might have to do it because my allergies have been pretty bad this year. I read online as well that if you take like a tablespoon of honey, like local honey, within like 10 kilometers of your house, it helps with seasonal allergies because you're taking the pollen, like the local pollen, and you're digesting it. So I thought that was interesting. I might try that and see if it actually makes a difference. I also read online too that that was just a myth, so Who knows? I mean, in my head, it kind of makes sense. I feel like for a first layer, that's pretty good. And now I'm going to do this last section right here for our lavender field. So right here, this may be, I would consider this your middle zone for sure, where you're like, there's not much depth to it. It looks kind of flat. That is the point. We're going to add some more details, so don't worry. But you'll see if I just keep adding like directly while it's wet, it's like it's not doing anything. I'm not creating depth. I'm just blending colors. It's not really sitting on top of it. That's where the wet on dry comes in. So don't worry and don't spend too much time trying to get the perfect placement of depth, because with wet on wet, it's all just going to blend anyway. Oh no, I want this to be a little bit more, less bluey, more light. My sky's dry, so I'm leaning on it. Okay. Okay, so I ran into a little bit of technical difficulties where my camera stopped recording while I was still painting. So this is where I got to before I realized that I wasn't recording. So I really quickly just did the first layer of the lavender field, and then I'll show you the mountains and how to do some stuff, and then I'll switch back to the one that I was working on. Okay, so the key thing here that I want us to focus on with the lavender field is that it's going to take multiple layers for it to kind of all come together. So just don't feel overwhelmed or feel like it's just not working and not looking good. Again, that's kind of the middle zone that we talked about earlier. I promise it does come together. Okay, because I want the distance to be the distance, I don't want to put too much detail into it. So when I go towards the back, I'm just going to do like little, kind of like little squiggly lines. And you'll see I've really watered down the purple. So it's kind of a wash of a purple. And I might even bring in some different colors of the purple in here. Just like that. Not a lot of detail at all. I also brought in a little bit of brown right here, and I added a bit of indigo as well to kind of just create a little bit of separation between the fields. It's a little bit too bright, so I'm going to use just water on my brush. There we go, to kind of blur it out. And I'm going to repeat kind of the same technique that I just did for this bottom one, just kind of doing some lines, switching up between my different colors, just like that. I'm using a wash again, not very bright colors. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. And then as we start to kind of progress down, that's when I'm going to add just a little bit more detail. And I'm using the very tip of my brush, and I am just kind of blotting around different spots, mixing up different purples in my palette as I go. There's really no reasoning behind the placement. I'm just kind of letting it flow, except for this part right here. I want where my ink marks are to be a little bit darker than the rest. So that's when I'll come in here with that darker color. And I'll kind of blot around to, again, just create a little bit of shadow between the fields. All the way down. Maybe bring a little bit more purple up. And then I would add a third layer to this part for sure. I'm happy with how it's looking right now, but I'm definitely going to go in one more time, especially around the shadowed area, and add a little bit more depth to this one. But I'm now happy with this part. So now we're going to mix up a little bit more darker purple, because I have a lot of washes in my palette. I'm going to activate some of this. I'm going to mix one with a little bit of indigo to make it a little bit more darker purple. I'm going to mix purple with some red that I had in my palette. Okay, so now we're doing the same thing, but we're going to add just a lot more detail, which just means a lot more smaller blots all the way around, just using the very tip of your brush. Again, this is what I'd like to call the middle zone, where it feels kind of awkward and strange, but the piece will come together, so just stick through it. And I want my darker part again to be where my ink lines are. And I'm even going to bring it up a little bit so it kind of just looks like a bunch of lavenders right here. So this is a very loose watercolor technique. Loose watercolors, adding in different types of colors like blues to shadow all around where the ink marks are, coming up a little bit so it kind of shadows and looks like a bunch of them. I'm even going to add a little bit more like blue to different parts. I'm going to come up here with some lighter purples, doing the same technique. Don't forget to add different shades of purples as well. That's how the piece starts to come together. And that is what I did all the way around. So the key here as well is to make sure you're leaving enough space to let your first layer kind of shine through as well, right? That's how you kind of create the layer in depth. So you're going to repeat what you just did here, down at the bottom right here. Just repeating exactly what we just did. The darker colors more towards the bottom, maybe some blues up here. I also wanted to add a little bit of like a complementary color as well. Some yellow that looks a little green to me. Got a muggy color. It's a little bit of a complementary color. Maybe like it looks like the reflection a little bit from the sunset. Okay, add in my purples now. Okay, and then you just repeat that all the way down. So for my mountain part, I used a very, very, very light wash of blue, and I did my mountain first. And the reason I did my mountain first was that way when I go in with my green, I'll be able to kind of go over top the sky just ever so slightly, and it will just look really blended and very nice. So I wouldn't do, and it's really hard to paint. Like, let's just say this was green and I'm kind of scrubbing around it. There's also a chance that I could start lifting up that green pigment and bringing it into my blue, which we don't want. So I'm going to do my mountain first. In my mountain area, and then once I had my wash down, I picked up a little bit more blue pigment and I tapped the very top of it, just the top, just to give it a little bit more depth to it and make it stand out and have it not just be flat on my page. Bringing it down just a little bit. Okay, cool. Once that mountain was dry, then we go in and we can paint the trees. So I'm going to dry it real quick. I mixed some sap green, some hooker's green, and I also mixed a little bit of red to it as well. I absolutely love mixing in red with my greens. I feel like it just gives it so much of a natural earthy tone. Okay, I'm really happy with that. And I'm just using a wash. You want to make it look in the distance. You don't want to add too much detail. because then it's just going to mess with your perception when you're looking at your piece. So again, I'm just using the very tip of my brush, using the exact same technique that we just used for the bottom. Just really loose blots all around, creating some tree-like shapes, just staying inside really loosely the sketch provided. Just like that. I've also, you can see on some of them, I've left a little bit of white space, which is the paper, just little spots, which is just the paper. I find, again, that's just an extra way to add, an easy way to add some extra details. Okay, so to create depth and dimension, we're using the wet on dry technique, which is having a dry surface, painting on top of it. Otherwise, if I was just to add, I'll show you, like a darker color right now, to see how it just kind of naturally blends and bleeds, and it's a very soft blend. I want this color, this shadow, to kind of sit on top of it. So I'm going to dry these so I can move on to the next layer. So I didn't mix any extra coloring at all to this. This is just the same color that I used for the tree. And you're going to see now that this is dry, it's just going to sit right on top of it, which is kind of cool. So one thing to keep in mind too, and I'm going to bring over the piece of artwork that I had done the sunset. You don't see a sun on this, right? So I'm just going to pretend that my sun is behind the windmill, which means that my shadowing should be on this side on the right, and then it should also be on the left corner on here. So let's do some shadow work. So I'm going to start over here, and again, I'm using the exact same color that I had already mixed up. Because it's dry, it just sits on top. So that's going to be my first layer. I'm just hitting up the corners. Just kind of creates a little bit of depth to my piece, and I'm going to do the opposite side over here. So it gives the illusion that my sun is behind here. So again, I'm going to dry this really quick. So I mixed a little bit of brown into my green. I want a little bit more. A little bit of brown into my green, and I'm just going to repeat the process. And this, I think, really just kind of makes it come alive. And again, you don't want this to be perfect. This is part of that loose watercolor where when you kind of just sit with it, it kind of just comes together. Okay, cool. There we have it. Our blotted trees, they're going to be in the distance. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to this watercolor because this is kind of where my video stopped. And we're going to work on our, how many layers have I done? 1, 2. I'm going to work on my third layer now on this. I'm going to mix up again a kind of dark purple. And I'm going to mix up this time my indigo with some of my cadmium red. And I want it to be dark. And I'm going to go in now again, just over top. I want it to be less watery, so I'm going to add a lot more pigment to this. There we go. It's just going to sit on top, just like this. I'm blotting again. I'm doing smaller blots right here and before, because I want to again leave some of the second and first layer to kind of just shine through. So just using little blots, and it's going to kind of make this piece kind of come alive. I'm going to add a lot more red to this part, because up here you'll see how it kind of starts to go gradually towards more purple versus the blue. I'm going to add a lot more red for the shadow up here, and I'm going to repeat what I just did, leaving the second and first color to kind of shine through. Okay, that's so fun. And I'm going to go in now on this one in particular and just add a little bit more detail to it. I love kind of watching it all kind of come together. It's so fun. And I'm going to do the same just ever so slightly, just right here. Just add a little bit more depth. I feel like, yeah, right in here is kind of flat. I just want to add a little bit more different types of purples in here. A shadow under here a bit. Okay, now in here, I'm going to add a lot more blue just to kind of sit on top. More bright. And letting that shine through as well. And I kind of just watered down that blue that I was just using a little bit and kind of going through the background with some purples and blues. Okay, so I want to add a little bit more blue down here as well to kind of complement the lots of extra blues that I just kind of put in here. Just using the very tip of my brush, adding in more textures. Add more blue down here too. I'm kind of just jumping around now. Adding different shadows and details. You'll kind of see with the more layers that you have down too, I feel like it's just coming together just that much more. Okay, I'm gonna work on the windmill. And I'm gonna start with my initial shadow right underneath my window right here. And you're gonna see too, like when you start, I guess, playing around with black as your shadow, it can be, how do I say this? It can be hard because black is so pigmented. I recommend if you're ever using black to shadow, definitely use the paper to make sure you haven't gone too dark, because there's nothing worse than starting to layer in shadow and you've just gone so dark. And it's hard to come back from that. The paper in watercolor, it's not very forgiving, especially when you go too dark. Okay, so you'll see here, I'm doing the wet on wet technique. I got down that brownish color and I'm slowly working up and shadowing my corner. I feel pretty good about that. Come in here. Sorry, I just whacked the microphone. And I'm gonna add a little bit of detail right here. I see a harsh line kind of coming, so I'm gonna spread it out a little bit more. Okay, cool. So I can't really move on to anything else while this is wet, so I'm gonna dry this part right now. With that wash of shadow I just did, I'm gonna add a lot more brown to it because I kind of like having black. Now I'm gonna be careful with this and just kind of start with the wash. And I don't wanna paint that part yet. I'm gonna kind of paint around it. And I'm going to do a similar technique to what I was just doing at the bottom, is while it's this brown is wet, I'm going to kind of go in and shadow different parts of it. So now I'm mixing some black in here just to kind of darken it up, not a lot. And I'm going to go in and just touch and move around different parts, especially right here at the bottom to create a little bit more shadow. Don't forget this part. Add a little bit more. Okay, I'm gonna dry it. Actually, no, I'm gonna add dark brown to it, just right here. There we go, give it a little bit more depth. And I'm actually gonna tap the center and just lift up a little bit of pigment. And once I see how I'm picking up the brown and moving it around, I'm tapping my napkin. There we go, I like that. How I'm lifting up some of the paint just to give it more of like a natural highlight. Yeah, that looks really good. I'm gonna add a little bit of yellow here. I added a little bit of yellow. Oops. And now I just dragged too much. All right, gotta go in now and with just water and blend out that line and try again. I think I just picked up too much pigment. Okay. Now that it's dry, now I'm gonna go in with some yellow. And now I'm just gonna touch the very edge of it, and ever so slightly blend it out so it doesn't stand out too much. going to go in now and do the windows with the same color I kind of did the roof. I'm going to shadow probably this corner. Yeah, let's shadow this corner. I'm going to go in and shadow that again. Just shadowing the corners. Shadow right in here of the balcony, this cool balcony part, just right at the crease. Yeah, just right in there. I'm going to make this part a little bit darker too so it stands out. I'm going to shadow in here again. Blending it out with just water. Yeah, I like that. So now I'm going to go in with a little bit more black into that brown that we were using, and I'm going to paint. The reason why I'm not going in with just straight black is I feel like it's just going to be too overwhelming for this piece. So I wanted there to be a little bit of that brown to kind of just break it up. And I'm going to work in sections here, just like that. Doing the bigger part first. And I'm leaving that middle part because I'm actually going to paint that darker than these so they stand out a bit more. It's kind of hard to see, eh? At this point of the painting, I would say I'm pretty much done. I'm just kind of looking over it and figuring out if I want to make any changes, if I want to add any extra layers and depth to it. Right here, you'll see I'm just adding a little bit of shadow to my windmill. And then I'm going to reevaluate, maybe add some more shadow to the bottom of the windmill and maybe a little bit more in the lavender field. So take this time now to kind of look at your piece and see what needs to be added to yours. So I'm just finishing up my last details, and I just want to say thanks for painting with me, guys. I hope you had so much fun with this. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I can't wait to see how yours turned out.